So thank you all so much for joining us. As I said, this is our third lecture of our Bitesize Animal Law Series. And this series is an introduction to basic animal law, as most of you probably already know if you've been tuning into the other lectures. And we have 5 left, so they'll be the next 5 Wednesdays at 7 p.m. So thank you all so much for your interest in our series. And before I introduce tonight's speaker, I just want to give you a quick little housekeeping tip about the Q&A. So some of you probably already know this, obviously, from the previous webinars. But in order to participate in the Q&A, you will see the little Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. If throughout the webinar you have any questions you'd like to ask, please just pop them into the chat, or sorry, not the chat, into the Q&A, and we'll get to them at the end of the lecture. If you don't want your name to be seen when you leave a question, please just select Submit Anonymously so that we can't see your name when you write your question. And there's a great little facility that it enables you to vote questions up. So if you read a question that you would like to have answered as well, then just vote the question up. So at the end, we'll be able to see if there's some questions that have become really popular so we can ensure they get asked. Right, so I'll introduce our speaker for this evening. Tonight we're going to be hearing from Dr. Gareth Spark, and we're very fortunate because not only is he speaking tonight, he's going to be speaking next week as well. So thank you very much, Gareth. Gareth tonight is going to present on animal welfare ethics and science. And Dr. Spark is an associate professor at UEA Law School, University of East Anglia, and he's completed his LL.B and his LL.M by research from the University of East Anglia, and he holds a Ph.D from the University of Cambridge. So I would like to give you a very warm welcome, Dr. Gareth Spark, for being with us this evening on behalf of ALA, and I'm sure on behalf of all the attendees as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tiffany, and yes, thank you everybody for coming along today. Just a sort of a brief overview of what I want to say today, and then I'll pass it on to Tiffany for some questions, because we're going to run it in a Q&A session as with the previous ones. So as Tiffany said, just sort of keeping with the bite size theme here, I'm just going to give an introduction to animal welfare science. As I say to everybody on my animal welfare law course, I'm not a scientist, I'm not a biologist, I don't expect my students to be, I don't expect any of you to be, but I think animal welfare science does have a very important role to play in animal welfare law. And so I'll give a brief overview of what it is and how that works. And then similarly with ethics, as has been said on many occasions, you can't really talk about animal welfare law without talking about the ethical side of it. So I'll give a brief overview of that and how that works. And as I say, hopefully you'll find that interesting and have plenty of questions afterwards.
Excellent, thank you very much. So as Gareth has said, it's going to be Q&A style, just like the last 2 that we've had. So my first question for you, Gareth, this evening is going to be, how did animal welfare science become a significant public policy concern?
Excellent. No, thank you very much, Tiffany. So I think we can trace this back really in large part to Ruth Harrison's book, Animal Machines, published in 1964. And in this, Ruth Harrison, she documented some of the conditions in which animals in factory farming circumstances were actually kept. And in response to this, because it was quite a shocking book, which really did detail the very horrendous conditions in which animals were kept, Parliament actually commissioned the Bramble Committee, which reported in 1965 and set out a number of recommendations for improving animal welfare in intensive farming systems. Now, one thing that was absolutely vital and really did lead to a development in animal welfare, or I suppose led to a development in animal welfare science, which then led to a development in the law, was it recognized that it's not only the physical state of an animal which matters here. Of course, if an animal is suffering physically, then that animal's welfare is concerned. So the anti-cruelty laws, which some of you might know, the UK was one of the first to bring into place in the 19th and 20th centuries. These were focusing on preventing unnecessary suffering. Now, in this sense, of course, they were welfare laws. you have to prevent suffering to have good welfare. But one thing that animal welfare scientists have recognized is really that the absence of suffering is not the same as good welfare. So the law has developed alongside this to recognize that, and it's recognized a number of things. One, that physical suffering is, of course, important, but also mental suffering. And it's become increasingly clear that animals can also experience positive and negative emotions. So even if we just focus on the anti-suffering side of it for a moment, and we'll see how welfare science can actually go beyond that, but even focusing on just the anti-suffering side, that has to include physical suffering, mental suffering, and emotional suffering, because animals can be happy, sad, frustrated, bored. They can even suffer from depression, we now know. So if we accept, as moving on from the Bramble Committee, animal welfare science has accepted, that animals can experience negative emotions, we have to pose the question to legislators: how do they deal with this? And one of the examples that I like to give to illustrate the situation is just a little example of a human baby, perfectly healthy, but this human baby is simply left in a small playpen all day with no toys. The child's parents feed and change him or her appropriately. They ensure the child has all of the necessary inoculations. The child gets sick, they take the child to the doctors, but otherwise they simply leave the child in the barren playpen. Now, of course, I think most of us would accept that this is not a child with good welfare, but this is very often, at the best, the state in which many animals in intensive farming systems find themselves. And I think this illustrates that the absence of any kind of physical or perhaps even mental suffering here does not equal good welfare. So I think it's important to recognize that whatever one's ethical views may be about it, it's not feasible to expect that animals in my lifetime will cease to be used for human purposes. Whether you think that should be the goal or shouldn't be the goal for us to work towards, it's not realistic to expect it. So one thing I think that we should work towards is something which the Farm Animal Welfare Committee, and I'll say a little bit more about them shortly, has proposed, is to suggest that we can work towards a position where all, now they focus on farm animals, but I think we could extend this to all animals under human control, have a life worth living. If these animals, maybe they are bred to be slaughtered for food, maybe they are bred to be used in animal testing, at the very least, I think what we should work towards is, as I say, to give those animals a life worth living whilst they are alive. How can we do this without the input from animal welfare science? We need the science to look at animals' experiences, to try to tell us what their experiences are, to say how can we give them a life worth living in these conditions.
Excellent. Thank you, Gareth. Okay. What are some of the main animal welfare principles which currently affect legislative policy?
I think here we will start with the Farm Animal Welfare Committee and its 5 freedoms. Now, again, Farm Animal Welfare Committee, so these 5 freedoms have been developed in relation to farm animals. But one thing that I think is undeniable is if we look at Section 9 of the Animal Welfare Act, and that some of you might know is the main general welfare provision in English law. Section 9 of the Animal Welfare Act very clearly borrows from these 5 freedoms to set out a legislative duty on people who are responsible for animals to provide for the animal's needs. And the 5 freedoms are freedom from hunger and thirst, freedom from discomfort, freedom from pain, injury, and disease, freedom to express normal behavior, and freedom from fear and distress. So all of these freedoms are, of course, prohibitive in nature in the sense that they are concerned with freedom from negative factors. Essentially, they seek to do no more, and the Farm Animal Welfare Committee doesn't claim that they are seeking to do any more, but they seek to do no more than to ensure a neutral existence for animals, farm animals or any other animals to which they are applied. Freedom from these various kinds of suffering then provides them with a neutral level from which we can potentially try to build to allow the animals to have positive experiences, to have that life worth living that we've talked about. So I think whilst the five freedoms are by no means, and they don't attempt to be, the be all and the end all, they provide a good basal foundation and are very important in that regard. If we move on to specifically the area of animal research, scientific testing on animal, then we have three key principles known as the three R's: replacement, reduction, and refinement. So replacement, using non-animal methods of testing wherever possible; reduction, reducing the number of animals that are used in animal testing; and refinement, refining the methods of testing and housing for animals to try to minimize suffering. Again, these are generally, they are basal minimum requirements, but I think if we look at them and the five freedoms, especially how the five freedoms have been incorporated into Section 9, I think this puts us in a position where we can see, successfully or not, the law is trying to ensure neutral welfare for animals. So animal welfare science, I think, has had a massively positive impact in that regard. The question then becomes, how can we build upon this to improve the position for animals?
Excellent. Thank you very much, Gareth. Okay, what do you think is the most important principle of animal welfare science for legislatures to understand?
And I think this does build on from the previous point, which is, if we've reached the position where the law generally accepts. Now, again, we can debate how successful it is in practice, but I think the law generally accepts that animals should have at least this avoidance of unnecessary suffering. That's a general principle across most areas of English law. So if we are thinking about where we move on to next, how we improve the position further, I think the absolutely crucial point is to recognize one of the key principles of animal welfare science, which is that welfare is a continuum. It ranges from the negative to the neutral to the positive. So an absence of suffering can ensure neutral welfare, but that does not mean an animal has good welfare. It may have the possibility, the opportunity to have positive experiences, to have good welfare. So if we can recognize that the absence of suffering is our neutral welfare, our basal minimum from which to build, I think that will be very, very important. And I think that the second key principle for policymakers, legislators to consider is that animal welfare is a hugely multifaceted area. So an animal's welfare, just like a human's welfare, of course, can be positive in some respects, but negative in other respects. So this means there may be circumstances where we do have to balance the positive with the negative. So just again, a very simple example I always use is an overweight animal that has to go on a diet, because being overweight can lead to diabetes, joint problems, all sorts of potential health, heart conditions for that animal. So the animal's welfare is negative in that respect. So to improve the welfare in that respect, we need to put the animal on a diet. But any of you who have ever had a pet look at you with those sad eyes when you go to the fridge and don't give him or her anything will know that this hunger, this frustration of not being fed as normal can have a negative impact on animals. So it is important to recognize that welfare is a balancing act. But I think one thing that is hugely important to recognize is that doesn't just mean we have to take the approach of saying, okay, if we're improving welfare in this respect, that's necessarily going to have a negative effect in a different area. We should look to see whether it is possible to have the positive effect without also having the knock-on negative effect. Just quickly, one very simple example that I've come across in reading a little bit about animal welfare science is laying hens. So if they are kept obviously in battery cages, then those conditions are pretty appalling for them. But there's evidence to say if they are allowed out to roam in big groups, there can be aggression between them, feather pecking, even cannibalism. So it might look as if the choice is between the negative welfare of being kept in cages or the negative welfare of aggression between hens. But there was research that was done which showed actually there are simple methods that can be put in place to allow the hens to roam in big groups, but to avoid or at least significantly reduce the aggression by, for example, putting structures through which less dominant, more submissive hens can hide. Different levels as well seems to be a positive thing to reduce aggression. So I think it's important to recognize those two key things. One, it's a continuum, it's a spectrum. Two, it's very multifaceted. We have to strike a balance, but we should always look to achieve the positive without a knock-on negative if possible. And I think a very good summation of two key questions to ask comes from Marianne Stamp Dawkins, where she has argued that there are two key questions we should ask. Sorry, that's, if you can hear in the background, that's my dog getting his 2 cents in. First, the question we should ask is, what does the animal need? So look at the animal's physical, mental health. What does the animal need to achieve that neutral state? And second, what does the animal want? Look at animals' preferences and desires, because if we have that neutral state and then allow the animal to fill his or her preferences, that can push towards the positive welfare experience.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Okay. Why are ethics important to the issue of animal welfare?
I think that's nowadays. I think for many people, hopefully, maybe I'm being slightly optimistic here, but hopefully for many people, it seems self-evident that animal welfare does matter, that animals are sentient beings, their welfare matters and should matter. Now, this, of course, hasn't always been the case, and ethicists were crucial in driving the progression here. As science began to recognize the sentience of animals, that they can feel pleasure and pain, that began to progress the law. But there were still, especially if we think about the more religious society back in the 1800s, there were still significant moral questions. Okay, they can feel pleasure and pain, but humans are more important, so we should pursue our own ends. That was the widespread feeling. So ethicists putting through arguments as to why animal interests do matter were absolutely crucial in driving the debate. And in this regard, a very good book called Animal Welfare Law has a number of chapters on it. And this one by Palmer and Sandow lists 5 main ethical theories, of which I'll just provide sort of a brief summary of each, and then at the end sort of sum up how we can use these different ethical theories. So they list, but I'm of course not saying these are exhaustive by any stretch of the imagination, but the main theories they look at are contractualism, utilitarianism, animal rights, contextualism, and respect for nature. So a contractualist view essentially says we should be moral, we should behave well morally towards other people because it's in our own best interest. If you like, it's an implicit societal contract. Treat others well, they will treat you well. Now, this, of course, as applied to animals, has its problems. The idea is that, of course, we still cannot fully communicate with animals. How do we get across to the animals this agreement? Of course, many of you will know, of course, having interacted with animals, you treat a certain animal well, that animal will treat you well. If you treat the animal badly, that animal will show fear, aggression towards you. So in that sense, the contractualist view can still apply to animals, But the problem, I think this lacks a persuasive power, because if you are treating animals well in order to be treated well by them, they'll show you affection, they'll play with you. Now, realistically, you're only going to want to do that if you would find it positive to have that positive interaction with animals. So it's not really going to persuade people to treat animals well. That doesn't mean contractualism has no value, but it's very much human-centered. The one area where perhaps it can have a persuasive effect is in the commercial realm. Classic example would be farmers, if they can sell their products labeled by the RSPCA Freedom Food Scheme, for example, as high positive welfare foods, then consumers might pay more for them. So it can have some positive effects, but I think it's largely human-centered. A utilitarian approach, now this is probably the ethical theory with which I was most familiar before starting any research in the area of animal ethics. Utilitarianism is essentially the balance. Anytime you're making a decision, you must take that course of action which maximizes overall pleasure and minimizes overall negatives. Now, we can factor animals into this balance. People like Peter Singer do that, one of the leading animal utilitarian ethics theorists. Now, the problem that we do get with utilitarianism is that if inflicting suffering, restricting the interest of any being, human or non-human, will actually create more positive effects for other people, then we, on a utilitarian theory, not just can do it, but should do it. The extreme example, if enough people feel pleasure from watching torture, well, then that pleasure can outweigh the negative. So a strict utilitarian view could be used to justify animal testing, intensive farming of animals, but Singer suggests that this isn't actually true. He suggests that we can have a utilitarian ethic, but say there are certain interests that living sentient beings have that cannot be overridden in favor of the interest of others. Applying this to animals, the interest in having living and having the chance to have future positive experiences, the interest in not having future negative experiences. Singer suggests that we shouldn't be able to weigh this against the pleasure of other beings. Now, I think this leads then very nicely into an animal rights theory, because I fully agree with Singer in the sense that I think utilitarianism permeates so much of decision making today. I think we just have to see that in the current circumstances with the lockdown. I think there's clearly a utilitarian ethic as to when we go back to normal, in inverted commas, life. But there comes a stage at which there are certain interests we shouldn't be allowed to be balanced against pleasures of other beings. But then this seems to strip utilitarianism of its essential balance, and it moves us to a rights-based theory, because a rights-based theory says that any beings which come within this theory, and Reagan, the key proponent here, recognizes that many sentient animals can come within that theory, they have certain rights that cannot be overridden. The right to life, the right to avoid suffering would be, of course, two key ones. If we subscribe to an animal rights view, then this would require the abolition of farming animals for food, scientific testing. Now, whether that's realistic or not is a different question that I'll come to in the summation at the end. But that's the key difference between utilitarianism and a rights-based ethic. Utilitarianism, essentially balancing competing interests. Rightism saying you have certain rights that cannot be overridden. And just very quickly to sum up contextualism and respect for nature, which I think are interesting theories, but I think tell us a little bit less than some of the others. So a contextualist ethic basically says the degree of moral duty we have to animals differs based on the context in which we interact with them. So greater duties towards our own companion animals than we would have to wild animals, for example. To me, as I always tell my students, this is undeniable. I completely agree with this. I think it applies to animals as much as to human relationships, but it doesn't really tell us where we set the level of duty. It tells us, and this is reflected in the law, that we generally have greater duties towards companion animals than to wild animals, but it doesn't tell us where we should set that level of duty. Finally, then, a respect for nature ethic. As it suggests, we're concerned with respecting nature, genetic diversity, survival of species. So these are the five main theories. And again, as Palmer and Sando surmise in their chapter, none of these theories is perfect. They all have a little bit of value. For what it's worth, I would tend to consider myself a theoretical rightist, but a practical utilitarian, because I don't think it's realistic in my lifetime to have animal rights to the full extent that morally I believe they should have. So if none of these theories is perfect, if there's debate amongst even ethicists as to which theory is better in inverted commas, how can ethics help us in campaigning to improve animal welfare law? Well, the one thing I always say, it's sort of a standard thing I say to my students that I put in any articles I write when this comes up, is the vast literature clearly shows that animal ethics is a significant concern for a vast number of people. The majority of society, I think, does have a concern. We haven't reached any universal agreement as to what is the right theory, but we have got, I think, near universal agreement that it does matter. So I think if we were to combine this with animal welfare science, we can build on the writing of people like Singer and Reagan to say why animal interests do matter. We can then take the science to say, look, animal welfare is not just about the avoidance of suffering. It's about this continuum. It's about trying to provide animals with this possibility of having positive experiences. So I think if we are looking to campaign to improve the law, I think those would be areas that we can focus on, drawing from animal ethics and animal welfare science. And just to finish up with another point that Marianne Stamp Dawkins makes, which again I think is a very persuasive one. Now she says, linking to the fact that there's often a lot of debate over whether animals' interests matter in their own right, she suggests that a tactical, if you like, way forward might be to stress the human benefits that can be received from treating animals well. And the example that she gives, which I think is a very pertinent one, is if we were to reduce large-scale factory farming, we could put that as an animal welfare issue. That will hopefully persuade a lot of people using animal ethics, using animal welfare science. But for those who aren't persuaded, we can talk about the environmental benefits. So we can use the benefits to human society to bolster our animal ethics arguments as well. So I think that would be a way we can blend it all together to try to have a positive effect to improve animal protection, animal welfare law. Excellent.
Oh, there we
So I
go.
think that's thank you very much. I think that's really all I want to say for now. But of course, any questions at all, I will be delighted to answer.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I had myself muted. So thank you so much, Dr. Spark, for speaking with us this evening. It was an interesting topic for certain. And he will be joining us again next week. And next week's topic, is going to be killing animals without proof of unnecessary suffering, a legal perspective. So we're really looking forward to having you again with us next week. And thank you so much for presenting tonight, Gareth.
Thank you very much, Tiffany, and thank you very much, everybody, for being here and for your really very good questions. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you all so much. And we hope to see you again next week, Wednesday at 7 p.m. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Bye, everybody.